She was 18 years old, alone in a dark alley, counting 17 cents, the only thing standing between her and a life she never chose. He was a broken man who had stopped trusting himself years ago. He almost kept walking. He almost kept walking. But something made him turn around, and that one decision would unravel a 3-year conspiracy, expose a killer hiding behind a judge's robe, and force two wounded souls to ask the question neither of them knew how to answer. Can you trust someone enough to let them see how badly you've been broken? This story reminds us that safety is not a place. It is a person who chooses to stay. Welcome to this channel, where every story is set under wide open skies and honest hearts. We tell tales of the American West, of cowboys and courage, of love hard-won and tenderly kept, of mothers who sacrifice everything. If this story stirs something in you, a memory, a feeling, a quiet hope, hit like, drop a comment below, and subscribe. The best ones always stay till the end.
The back alley beside the Golden Spur Saloon smelled like spilled whiskey, horse dung, and the particular kind of dust that never fully settled in a town built on sand and bad intentions. It was past midnight in Dusty Creek, Arizona territory, August of 1873, and Ruth Calloway was counting money she already knew was not enough. 7 pennies. A dime. Something that might have been a button she mistook for a coin in the dark. She counted again. 17 cents. The stage to Tucson cost $2.50. She had been counting the same money for 3 weeks. Ruth sat with her back against the brick wall, not lying down, not collapsed, but sitting with the careful deliberateness of someone managing pain in her ribs and refusing to let it reach her face. She was 18 years old, though most people who looked at her lately guessed younger, because 3 years of not enough food and not enough sleep had kept her somewhere between girl and woman, in a way that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with what had been taken from her. Her dark hair was pinned back badly. Her dress was the color it turned after too many washings in cold water. Her right boot had a worn patch on the inner sole where something hard had been pressing against the leather from the inside for 3 years. She had approximately 12 minutes before Elias Horn noticed she was not scrubbing the back hallway floor of the Golden Spur Saloon. She did not cry. She had stopped crying 2 years ago, when she understood that it only gave Elias something to feel satisfied about, that her tears were a kind of payment she was making to him. And she had decided she was done making payments she had not agreed to. She was on her 4th escape plan. The first 3 had failed in ways that cost other people more than they cost her, which was the part she could not stop thinking about. A decent man named Cal Dawson had lost his grazing lease trying to help her reach the county seat. She had sat in the sheriff's office for 40 minutes on her 3rd attempt, explaining herself to a man who drank free at the Golden Spur every Friday evening, and he had personally walked her back before she finished her sentence. The trap was not the absence of exits. She had identified that much clearly. The trap was that every exit had one of Elias Horn's people standing in front of it, and every person who tried to help her paid for it in ways she had not anticipated, and she could not keep asking people to pay. So she sat in the dark and counted 17 cents, and thought about the problem the way her father had taught her to think about survey problems when she was a child, sitting at the kitchen table, in a house that no longer existed. You identified what you had. You identified what you needed. You identified the gap between them. Then you looked very carefully for what you were not yet seeing, because there was always something you were not yet seeing, and that thing was always the key. What she was not yet seeing was the resource, not the money, not the legal standing, not the witness who would matter in a courtroom. She had the evidence. She had carried the evidence in her boot for 3 years. What she did not have was the person who could stand beside the evidence and make a judge listen. She had not found that person yet. But she was going to find them, because the alternative was what Elias had planned for the coming year, and she was not going to let that happen. She was going to be alive and free and on her own land before her 19th birthday, or she was going to have done everything in her power trying. The night air moved through the alley, carrying the smell of the desert beyond the town's edge, the dry sage and cooling rock smell that she associated with the open country outside Dusty Creek, the country her father had surveyed and mapped and loved, with the particular devotion of a man who understood terrain the way other men understood music. She thought about her father most clearly at night. Thomas Calloway had been an engineer, precise and patient, with large hands that could draw a topographical line so fine it looked like it had been made by a machine. He had taught her to read maps before she could read words, and to navigate by starlight before she was tall enough to reach the kitchen counter, and to remember numbers with the kind of total recall that he said was a gift, though she had spent 3 years wishing she could forget the number carved into the piece of mesquite wood in her boot. Because remembering it meant remembering the night he gave it to her, and that night was the last one before everything ended. 340 SYC 1870 TC, 340 acres in Sycamore Valley, registered to Thomas and Eleanor Calloway. Hers, he had said, whatever happens. She heard footsteps. Not Elias. The weight was wrong and the pace was wrong, and there was a quality to the sound she could not immediately name, a deliberateness that was different from the decisive stride of a man going somewhere, or the careless stride of a man coming from the saloon. These were the footsteps of someone moving carefully, the way you moved when you did not want to frighten anything in the dark. Ruth's hand closed around the small penknife she kept in her dress pocket. She did not move otherwise. She controlled her breathing and waited. The footsteps stopped at the mouth of the alley. The man who stood there was large, broad through the shoulders, wearing a trail coat that had seen a great deal of weather, and a hat that had seen considerably more. He stood with his back to the alley. He had stopped walking, and he stood there with his back turned, and he did not move for what felt like a very long time. Ruth watched him. She had 3 years of practice reading men from the set of their shoulders, the position of their hands, the quality of their stillness. This man's hands were at his sides, open, not reaching for anything. His stillness was not the stillness of someone listening for her. It was the stillness of someone who had stopped and was deciding something. He stood there for what she counted as close to a full minute, a large and tired man in the dark, and then he turned around. He crossed to where she was sitting and crouched down to her eye level without hurrying, without any performance of urgency or concern, and she ran the evaluation she had learned to complete in 3 seconds, reading intention in the angle of a man's eyes, the set of his jaw, what his breathing told her about what he wanted. She had become very accurate at this evaluation over 3 years of needing to be. What she found made her go still in a way that was different from her usual stillness. There was nothing there. No calculation behind the eyes. No performance of sympathy designed to produce obligation. No hunger of any kind. Just a man looking at her the way you look at a situation you are trying to understand accurately. "Do you need help?" he said, not loud and not soft, and not a direct question from someone waiting for a direct answer with no particular investment in what the answer would be. "I am fine," Ruth said, the most practiced sentence in her vocabulary. He looked at the way she was holding her ribs with her breathing, looked at her lip, looked at the mud on the hem of her dress that she had not been able to clean in the dark. "All right," he said, and did not stand up. He settled back against the opposite wall, elbows on his knees, eyes turned toward the street beyond the alley mouth, as though he had made a decision and was comfortable with it, as though he had the entire night available and no particular use for it elsewhere. Ruth waited for the next move, the move that revealed what this was, the price that was going to be named, the favor that was going to be asked. In her experience, which was considerable and specific, there was always a next move. There was no next move. He simply stayed there, quiet and completely still, not watching her, not pressing her, not explaining himself. The rain that had paused came back, the warm, heavy August rain of the Arizona Territory, falling straight down without wind and making the alley smell like wet brick and distant earth. She watched him for a full 30 seconds. He did not move. That was what kept her from running. Not a promise, not any display of strength or protection, just patience that required nothing from her in return, patience that had no agenda she could identify. And in her experience, patience with no visible agenda was the rarest thing she had encountered in 3 years of looking for it. The back door of the Golden Spur opened. Elias Horn stepped out. He was a wide man in his 50s with a complexion that had gone permanently red from years of standing near whiskey fumes, and a pair of small eyes that were always performing an addition of some kind, always totaling something up. When he saw the two of them, his face rearranged itself into the expression she knew best from him, the one that wore a smile the way a door wears a coat of paint, covering what was underneath without changing the structure. "Wade," he said, and his voice had the particular warmth of a man who has just identified an opportunity. "Been a while. This girl bothering you any?" The man against the wall got to his feet. He turned and looked at Elias Horn with a pair of gray eyes, and he did not look away. Ruth had not seen anyone look at Elias that way in 3 years. She had not been entirely certain it was still possible. The man said nothing. He simply looked. And Elias Horn, who was considerably better at reading genuine danger than most people gave him credit for, took one step back and then another, and then he said something about the late hour and went back inside and pulled the door closed. The man settled against the wall again. The rain came down. Ruth sat in the wet dark and felt something she had not felt in a very long time, something small and cautious, and not yet ready to be named. She thought, "This one might be the resource I have not been able to see." She thought, "I will need to find out." She thought, "I will need to be careful about how I do that, because I cannot afford to be wrong again." Outside the alley, a horse shifted its weight and blew out a long breath, the sound of an animal that has been standing patiently and is in no particular hurry to stop. That night did not end the way stories like to end things, with a confrontation or a declaration or someone's fist connecting with someone's jaw. What it ended with was rain and two people standing in an alley having a negotiation, which was considerably less dramatic and considerably more useful. Callum Wade had not planned to be in Dusty Creek that evening. He came for rope and deworming powder for the herd, both of which he had purchased and loaded onto Ezra before the sun went down. He had intended to ride the 12 miles back to Broken Spur Ranch before the rain started, which he had failed to do, and now he was standing in a wet alley in the dark next to a young woman who knew the law and showed no signs of being frightened of him, which he found simultaneously relieving and disconcerting. "You are Callum Wade," she said. It was not a question. "Yes." "Former deputy marshal out of Tucson. You have not been to town in approximately 4 years. You live at Broken Spur Ranch 12 miles east on the old survey road. You came tonight for supplies, rope, and deworming powder, based on what Garrett mentioned at the feed store last week." Callum looked at her. "You listened to that conversation." "I listen to most conversations," she said. "Elias sends me to the store for supplies twice a week. It is useful to know things. Your ranch has been running approximately 200 head through a 14-month drought. Your main hand, Garrett, has limited use of his left hand from a branding injury. Your banknote is current, but you are approximately 6 months from a cash flow problem if the drought does not break." The rain fell straight down between them. Callum took a moment to recalibrate his understanding of who he was talking to. "You figured all of that from the feed store," he said. "From the feed store and the bank notice board and several conversations I was not supposed to be listening to." She paused. "I am Ruth Calloway. I have been under Elias Horn's legal guardianship for 3 years, since my parents died in a fire when I was 15. Elias is my court-appointed guardian by order of Territorial Judge Harlan Crail. I cannot leave his custody without a legal mechanism. I have attempted escape 3 times, and each time the mechanism I tried was blocked, or the person who tried to help me paid a cost I did not anticipate." "Cal Dawson," Callum said. He knew Dawson, had heard about the lease. "Yes. I will not do that again. If there is a way out of this situation, it has to be through a structure that Elias cannot simply dissolve, and it has to be one that does not require someone else to absorb the cost of helping me. She looked at him steadily. You came into this alley, which means you made a choice. I would like to understand what kind of choice it was before I make any decisions based on it. Callum thought about how to answer that honestly. I heard a sound, he said finally, and I turned around. That is the full extent of my planning. What kind of sound? The sound of someone trying not to make one. She looked at him for a moment with an expression he could not quite read. Then she said, I see. All right. What are you proposing? He had not been proposing anything because he had not gotten that far yet. But standing in the rain with this young woman who had just accurately described his ranch's financial situation from overheard conversations, he found a proposal forming. Broken Spur needs help, he said. Legitimate help. I can offer paid work, room and board, 90 days minimum. That gets you out of the Golden Spur and gives you time to figure out whatever comes next. She shook her head immediately. You cannot negotiate a labor arrangement with Elias as though I am an employee he can lend out. He is my court-appointed guardian. That is a different legal instrument. Any arrangement would have to operate within the guardianship framework, which means he retains authority to dissolve it on his preference. He would let me go for 90 days and bring me back the moment it suited him, and there would be nothing either of us could do about it. You know guardianship law, Callum said. I found a pamphlet from the Tucson Bar Association in the trash behind the attorney's office 2 years ago. I have most of it memorized. She said this without any particular pride, as a person states a fact. But there is a mechanism that might work. A temporary labor secondment under the existing guardianship framework is different from a simple employment arrangement. If the agreement is written, witnessed, and includes direct payment to Elias at a rate that benefits him, he has a financial incentive to maintain it. He cannot legally dissolve an active secondment agreement without cause, and cause has to be documented and reviewed. It gives us approximately 90 days of protected time. Callum absorbed this. You have been thinking about this for a while. I have been thinking about this for 3 years. She said it simply. I have had time. The negotiation that followed took 20 minutes. The agreement they reached was a temporary labor secondment. Ruth would work at Broken Spur Ranch in a household management and ranch support capacity for a minimum of 90 days. Elias would receive $15 per month paid directly and in advance. Ruth would receive room, board, and documented working hours. The agreement would be written in duplicate and witnessed by a third party. Elias agreed with a speed that should have been more suspicious than it felt in the moment of relief. He was drunk enough that the money looked better than the inconvenience of negotiating, which Ruth had calculated. He signed the agreement with a pen he produced from his vest pocket, a fine-pointed surveyor's pen with a distinctive blue nib and a small repair mark on the barrel where it had been cracked and mended. Ruth's hands were perfectly still as she watched him sign. Her face showed nothing. Her breathing did not change. Callum noticed all 3 of these things and did not yet understand what they meant. Later, riding east on the dark road with Ezra moving steadily beneath him, and Ruth sitting up behind the saddle with both hands keeping herself upright and not holding on to him, Callum thought about the controlled exhale he had heard in the alley, the sound that had stopped him and turned him around. He had been right about what it was. It was the sound of someone managing pain with complete deliberateness, refusing to surrender to it. He had only heard that particular sound a few times in his life, and each time it had come from someone who had a great deal of experience with pain and had made a decision about how to carry it. He was thinking about Danny Reyes, who had made no sound at all, when Ruth spoke quietly behind him. The pen he used to sign the agreement, she said. It was my father's. Elias took it from our belongings after the fire. He has been using it as his own for 3 years. Callum said nothing. There was nothing to say that would be useful. I want you to know that I noticed, she said. I am telling you because I did not react, and I want you to understand that the lack of reaction was a choice, not an absence of feeling. I understand, Callum said. Good, she said, and did not speak again for the remaining 9 miles. The room he showed her the following morning was small and spare, with a window that faced east and caught the first light before the heat arrived. There was a narrow bed with a clean quilt, a table, a chair, a hook on the wall for clothing. No decoration, no softening gestures, just the functional minimum, which was exactly what she had been living without for 3 years. There was a bolt on the inside of the door. Ruth crossed the room and slid the bolt home. It caught with a clean, solid sound, the sound of a mechanism working exactly as designed. She stood with her hand on the bolt and listened to that sound for a long time. Then she sat down on the edge of the bed, which was softer than anything she had slept on since she was 15, and thought, "This is not the resource yet. This is the beginning of finding it." Do not confuse the beginning with the destination. But for the first time in 3 years, she went to sleep without listening for footsteps. The drought had been on for 14 months when Ruth Calloway arrived at Broken Spur Ranch, and the land wore it the way the Arizona high desert wears all prolonged hardship, by stripping itself to what was essential, shedding everything that was not necessary for survival, becoming a version of itself that was harder and more honest, and in a particular way that she recognized because she had been doing the same thing for 3 years, more itself than it had been before. The cattle showed the drought most clearly. 200 head, many of them visibly underfed, some showing the patchy coat of mange that comes when an animal's immune system is working too hard on too little. They moved slowly in the morning heat, conserving energy with the instinctive economy of creatures that understood scarcity without needing to reason about it. Callum handed Ruth the ranch ledger on her first full morning and asked her to document the herd's condition. He did not explain what format he wanted or what level of detail. He simply handed her the book and a pencil and went to repair the water trough in the north pasture. She spent 3 days on it. She went through the herd animal by animal, methodically, in the early morning hours before the heat made outdoor work punishing. She noted coat condition, weight estimation, mobility, visible health indicators. She cross-referenced what she observed against the feed records in the ledger and the water supply figures Callum had noted in the margins. On the 4th morning, she put the ledger on the kitchen table and went out to start on the kitchen garden, which had been ignored for months and was fighting the drought on its own without much success. Callum came in from the morning rounds and found the ledger. He read what she had written. He read it again. He sat down, which he did not usually do in the middle of the morning, and read it a 3rd time. She had not given him a list of sick cattle. She had given him an analysis. 47 head should be sold immediately this week, before the drought's continued pressure dropped sale prices further. She had named each animal by the ear tag numbers and explained her reasoning for each one. 83 animals were salvageable with a pasture rotation that would move them to the secondary water source on the North Range, which her examination of the terrain suggested was still running at reduced but viable levels. The remaining 70 needed supplemental feed for 30 days minimum, but would stabilize if they received it. She had calculated that selling the 47 would generate $340 at current sale yard prices. $340 was the exact amount needed to service the overdue banknote and keep the ranch out of foreclosure review for 6 months. She had not known the exact amount of the banknote. She had estimated it from the figures she had read in the margins of the ledger, cross-referenced against the payment schedule notation on the inside front cover that someone had made in pencil 3 years ago and never erased. Callum sat at the kitchen table and looked at the analysis for a long time. Then he closed the ledger and rode to the sale yard with the list of 47 ear tag numbers. On the 3rd day of that first week, Ruth found an arithmetic error in the feed cost projection Callum had made the previous month. He had applied the wrong cost per hundredweight to the supplemental feed calculation, which meant his drought response budget was short by approximately $80. The error was easy to make. The cost per hundredweight had changed in March when the supply route shifted, and the new rate had been noted in a separate column that was easy to miss if you were working quickly. She said nothing about it. She corrected the figures overnight on a fresh page, showed the original calculation, the correction, and the revised total with a brief note explaining the rate change. She left the revised page in the ledger on the kitchen table and was already in the kitchen garden when Callum came downstairs. He found the correction. He stood at the table and looked at it. He looked toward the window where she was visible crouching between the rows of struggling bean plants, working methodically from one end toward the other. He said nothing. She did not look up. That silence was the first language they genuinely shared. The equal language of two people who understood that work done well did not require commentary, that a correction given without humiliation was a courtesy rather than a judgment, and that acknowledging a mistake cleanly and moving forward was the most efficient use of everyone's time. The Arizona summer pressed down before 9 in the morning like a physical argument, and so they learned to conduct the ranch's business in the dark hours. Same rising time, 4 in the morning, before the stars had fully faded. Breakfast in the blue pre-dawn, neither of them particularly conversational at that hour, which suited both of them equally. The heavy work in the cool hours before and after the sun was at its peak. A midday rest that Callum initially tried to exempt himself from, until Ruth pointed out, with the same flat directness she applied to everything, that heat exhaustion reduced productivity by approximately 30% in the afternoon hours, and that the 30 minutes of rest cost less than it saved. He took the midday rest after that. She found in those early weeks that Broken Spur Ranch was a place that worked according to a logic she could understand and improve. Not a place of arbitrary rules and invisible punishments. Not a place where the standards shifted depending on what Elias needed to justify that day's mood. A place where effort produced results, and the results were visible, and the accounting was honest. She had not lived in a place like that for 3 years. And the experience of it was so unfamiliar that she spent the first 10 days waiting for the other logic to reveal itself, the hidden one that would explain why this was actually a trap. It did not reveal itself. The ranch was simply the ranch, demanding and dry and struggling in the drought, and honest about all three. Garrett, the main ranch hand, was a wiry man in his late 50s with a left hand that had been badly damaged in a branding accident years before, and had healed into limited function. He watched Ruth the way he watched weather, with patient attention and no particular expression until he had formed a view, and then with the quiet certainty of someone who had learned that his views were generally accurate. He did not talk much. Neither did she. They worked well together. On the second week, with the south pasture fence line needing full retensioning, and Garrett's left hand unable to manage the grip required for the wire, Callum asked Ruth to help. She agreed. It was heavy work that pulled at the shoulders and drew blood from unprotected palms if you were not careful about the angle of contact with the wire. She watched Callum work one section. She tried the next herself. The angle was wrong, and the wire went slack. Callum stepped behind her without thinking and put his hands over hers to correct the angle. It was purely mechanical, a reflex from years of teaching new hands the correct technique, completely, without any other intention. Ruth went rigid. Every muscle in her body locked at once, the involuntary response of a person whose experience of being touched without warning was specific and uniformly bad. She did not make a sound. She simply stopped moving entirely. Callum registered it in the same instant. He stepped back immediately, 2 full steps, putting clear space between them. "Sorry," he said. "I will explain it in words instead." That was the entire response. No over-explanation. No prolonged apology that would have required her to manage his feelings about having caused a reaction. No pretense that it had not happened. Just the acknowledgement, clean and complete, and an immediate offer of an alternative that gave her back control of the interaction. Ruth stood for a moment. Then she adjusted her grip and her angle, applied the tension, and the wire held. "Thank you," she said. "Aim for a 15-degree angle from vertical," he said. "The physics of it wants that line." "Understood," she said. They worked the rest of the fence line with 4 feet of distance between them and only the necessary conversation. And she thought about the step back he had taken and the economy of his response, and the fact that he had not made her accommodate his discomfort. And she thought, This is a different kind of person than I have been dealing with. I should pay attention to what that means. The hailstorm came in the third week, arriving without warning at 2 in the morning, the way Arizona summer storms arrive, as though the landscape has been holding something in reserve and has finally decided to release it all at once. Ruth woke to the sound of it hitting the tin roof, and beneath it, audible even through the noise, the sound of the horses in the barn communicating their opinions about the situation at volume. She was dressed and moving before she was fully awake, the body responding to a calculus that the conscious mind had not finished running. Callum was already in the barn. One of the lamps was lit and throwing orange light through the interior, which made the panicked animals worse rather than better. Ruth moved to the nearest agitated horse without speaking to Callum because there was nothing to say that was more useful than simply doing the work. She ran her hand along the horse's neck with the steady, deliberate pressure that communicated to the animal's nervous system that this was not an emergency requiring flight. They worked for 2 hours. 2 mares were close to foaling and needed sustained attention to keep them from injuring themselves in the chaos. The hail on the tin roof made conversation impossible. They developed a working language of gestures and eye contact, pointing to indicate where the next problem was, holding up a hand to say, "Stay where you are," moving into position with the particular coordination of 2 people whose nervous systems had learned to account for each other's presence without requiring instruction. When the storm moved on, the sudden absence of the noise was almost disorienting. They sat down on a hay bale in the near dark, the lamp having gone out sometime in the second hour. Both of them were completely soaked. Ruth's arms ached in a way that was entirely different from the aches she was accustomed to, because this one was from effort she had chosen rather than something that had been chosen for her. "You did not have to come out," Callum said. "Not your job." "Your horses are not my job either," Ruth said. "But I came." He was quiet for a moment. "Why?" he asked. She thought about it honestly in the way she tried to think about everything, without the performance of an answer that would land well. "Because I cannot sleep when I know something is frightened," she said. "I just cannot. It is not a decision. It is the way I am built." He did not answer. In the darkness, she could not see his face, but she could feel him not turning away, which was its own kind of answer. In the morning, Garrett found her at the water pump before Callum was up. He squinted at her the way old ranch hands squint at clouds when they are trying to determine whether weather is coming. "6 years I have worked for that man," he said finally, with the air of someone delivering a verdict they have been considering for some time. "Last night was the first time I have seen him let anybody share the barn with him during a storm." He picked up the bucket he had come for and walked back toward the cattle pens without elaboration, leaving her standing at the pump with the observation and no instructions for what to do with it. She thought about it for a long time while she pumped water. Then she went to start breakfast, because the morning work did not wait on thinking, and thinking could continue while hands were busy. The man who was actually dangerous did not look dangerous. This was, Ruth had learned, almost always the case. Harlan Crail arrived at the Dusty Creek cattle sale yard on a Tuesday morning in the third week of September, wearing a well-made suit of dark broadcloth and an expression of such thorough pleasantness that a person who did not know what to look for would have seen nothing at all concerning. He was in his late 50s, clean-shaved, with the careful posture of a man who had spent many years being looked at from the front of a courtroom and had adjusted his bearing accordingly. Callum was closing a sale on 30 cattle from the list Ruth had made when Crail appeared near the sale pen. He arrived at the pace of a man who has no particular destination, which Ruth had learned was the pace of a man who has a very specific destination and does not want that noticed. She was not at the sale yard. She was at Broken Spur, re-cataloging the winter feed inventory. She learned the details of the conversation later, from Callum, in the economy of words that had become their standard mode of transferring important information. Crail spoke about the drought, about the difficulty of the Eastern Range ranchers. He expressed genuine seeming sympathy for the cattle market. He asked with the mild interest of someone making conversation about the young woman who had come to help at Broken Spur Ranch. Just a neighbor's curiosity, his tone suggested, just the natural interest of a man connected to the community. Callum did not answer the question about Ruth. Riding home, he turned over the details of the conversation. Crail was the territorial court judge who had signed Ruth's guardianship order 3 years ago, placing her under Elias Horne's authority. That was public record. What was not public record was how Crail knew the name Ezra. He had used it in passing, a small reference to the horse, a comment about the animal's age and the difficulty of keeping old horses healthy in a drought. Callum had not mentioned Ezra's name to anyone in Dusty Creek in 4 years. He was certain of this. Someone had been watching the ranch closely enough to know which horse he rode and what its name was. He arrived home with that certainty sitting in his chest like a stone. He told Ruth at dinner, in the few sentences it took to lay out the relevant facts. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she sat quietly for a moment with the expression she wore when she was running a calculation. "Harlan Crail," she said. "He signed my guardianship papers. He is Elias's cousin by marriage. I did not know the connection until about 6 months ago when I heard Elias refer to him as Cousin Harlan in a conversation he was having with a business associate. By the time I heard it, I had already understood the rough shape of what was happening, but that confirmed the specific mechanism." Callum looked at her. "What do you mean by the rough shape of what was happening?" She looked at him steadily. "I mean that I have been aware for approximately a year that the reason I am under Elias's guardianship is not welfare. It is property." She paused. "My family's land in Sycamore Valley. I have been thinking about how to tell you this, and I have not yet decided whether the time is right." "Why does the timing matter?" She was quiet for a moment that was one beat too long, and he filed that pause away for later. "Because once you know the full shape of it, the situation changes," she said carefully. "And I need to understand some things about your motivations before that changes." Callum put down his coffee cup. "That sounds like you do not trust me entirely." "I do not trust anyone entirely," she said. "That is not a statement about you specifically. It is an accurate description of where 3 years of experience has left me. I am working on it." He considered this. "Fair enough," he said finally, which was not the response she had expected, and the absence of injured feeling in it was itself a piece of information she added to what she was learning about him. 2 days later, Harlan Crail rode out to Broken Spur Ranch. He came in the early evening, arriving at the fence line and calling out a greeting without dismounting, which was the behavior of a man who has calculated the exact distance from which he can observe without entering. He said he was passing through on county business. He talked for 5 minutes about nothing. He looked at Ruth once, a careful and cataloging look dressed up as a casual glance, the look of a man making an inventory. After Crail rode away, Callum and Ruth stood on the porch in the settling dust. "I can take care of myself," Ruth said. Ruth. The words came out flat and automatic, the reflex of 3 years of proving it. "I know that," Callum said, "but you do not have to do it alone." It was the first thing he had said to her that was not entirely practical, and it hung in the evening air between them. And Ruth looked at the dust cloud Crail's horse had left on the road and thought, the window of protected time is going to close. He is going to move, and I need to move first, and I need to understand exactly what I am dealing with before that happens. That night she took the piece of mesquite wood from her boot and looked at it in the lamplight of her room. 340 SYC 1870 TC. Her father's handwriting, rendered in her child's carving. 3 years in the dark of a boot sole, waiting. She had been patient for 3 years because patience was what the situation required. But patience was not the same as waiting. Patience was the careful management of timing, the discipline of not moving before the pieces were in position. And the pieces were almost in position. She could feel it the way her father had taught her to feel terrain, the way a good surveyor develops a sense for the ground even before the instruments confirmed it. She needed one more thing, one more piece, and she was increasingly certain she knew where to find it. Callum found her in the tack room at midnight on a Thursday in late September, and what he found stopped him in the doorway long enough that she heard him and looked up before he spoke. She had cleared the saddle stands to the walls and spread a large sheet of brown paper across the floor. She was working on it by the light of an oil lamp, drawing with a stick of charcoal, and the detail of what she was drawing was extraordinary. He stood in the doorway and looked at it for a long moment before he could make himself simply observe what was in front of him. It was a map, a topographical map, hand-drawn from memory, covering a territory of roughly 40 miles in every direction from a central point he recognized as Dusty Creek. The trail grades were accurate. The elevation changes were marked in the shorthand notation of professional survey work, with spot elevations noted at the points of greatest significance. The seasonal creek beds were distinguished from the permanent ones with a different line weight. The major geographical features he had ridden through hundreds of times were rendered with a precision that would have been impressive from a professional cartographer working with instruments. She was drawing it from memory. He was certain of this because there were no reference materials in the room, just the paper and the charcoal and her hand moving across the surface with the confidence of someone transcribing something that was already complete in her mind. "You drew this from memory," he said. "My father taught me." She did not look up immediately. He was a survey engineer for the Union Pacific before he came to Arizona. He had what the other engineers called total recall for terrain. He said it ran in families sometimes. In me, it runs somewhat differently. I see terrain as a spatial structure that persists in memory without degrading. I can reconstruct any landscape I have physically moved through. Callum came into the room and crouched beside the paper. He found Dusty Creek, found Broken Spur Ranch, found the road between them. Found, rendered in thin and very precise lines with a slightly different pressure than the surrounding terrain marks, what appeared to be a planned route running in a long curve from the northeast to the southwest, passing through a property boundary she had drawn in a different shade. "What is that line?" he said. "The projected route of the Arizona and Pacific Railroad's new connecting line between Flagstaff and Tucson." She set down the charcoal and looked at him directly for the first time since he had entered the room. "I found a routing memo in a coat pocket a year ago. A traveling engineer left his coat at the Golden Spur, and Elias sent me to hang it up. The memo was in the inside pocket. I read it before I hung the coat. The route runs directly through the northern section of my family's land in Sycamore Valley." Callum looked at the property boundary she had drawn. 340 acres, clearly delineated, with the railroad route passing through the upper northern section, like a line drawn through a mathematical proof, changing the value of everything it touched. "How much?" he said. "The land is worth approximately $200 at current valuation. With confirmed railroad right-of-way, it would be worth between $2,000 and $2,500, possibly more depending on how the access negotiations develop." She paused. "Harlan Crail knows this. He has known it longer than I have. He placed me under Elias's guardianship, specifically because a guardian has administrative authority over estate claims on behalf of a minor or incapacitated ward. He intended for Elias to sign the land over on my behalf before I reached legal majority and could act independently." Callum sat back on his heels and looked at her. "You have known this for how long?" he said. "The full shape of it, approximately 8 months. The pieces of it, over the past 2 years, as I assembled the information." She reached down and removed the right boot from her foot. She pried up the inner sole and removed a small piece of mesquite wood and held it out to him across the map. It was worn smooth on the surfaces that had been against leather and skin for years, but the carving was clear. 340 SYC 1870 TC. "My father gave me this the night before the fire. He told me the land was mine. He told me whatever happens. I have been carrying this for 3 years." Callum took the piece of wood and looked at it carefully. The carving was old, made by a child's inexperienced hand, but the marks were deep enough to have survived years of wear without losing their legibility. "Why have you not acted on this?" he said. "Because evidence alone is not sufficient." Her voice was completely level. "A piece of mesquite wood and a girl's testimony against a territorial judge and his appointed guardian is not a legal case. It is a story. For it to become a case, I need documentation that corroborates the fraud. I need a lawyer who has no relationship with Crail. And I need a witness who has standing that a court will respect. She looked at him steadily. Standing means credibility. It means someone the court cannot dismiss. A former deputy marshal with 15 years of service and a documented record would have standing. A young woman who has been under guardianship would not. The silence that followed had a different quality than their usual silences. It was the silence of two people arriving simultaneously at the same understanding. "Why did you not tell me this when you came here?" he said. Ruth was quiet. The pause was the same one he had noted at dinner 2 evenings ago, the one he had filed away. "Because I needed to know first whether you would help me because of me," she said finally. The words came out carefully, as though she had been carrying them for some time and was uncertain whether this was the moment to set them down. "Or because of what I have. The land is worth money. You have financial pressure on the ranch. I needed to know that those two facts were not connected to each other in your thinking before I trusted you with the information." Callum looked at her for a long moment. He thought about the cattle analysis she had left on the table without taking credit for it. The corrected ledger. The 2 hours in the barn during the hailstorm. 3 weeks of working beside him with complete competence and zero performance, never asking for anything, never leveraging what she was doing into a claim on him. "I understand why you thought that," he said, "and I understand why you waited to tell me." "Does it change anything?" she said. He put the mesquite wood carefully back on the paper between them. "It changes what I thought I was dealing with," he said. "It does not change the fact of what I am dealing with, which is someone who has been running a long and careful strategy alone for 3 years, and is now in a position where she needs a piece she does not have." "Yes," she said, "that is accurate. I am going to need some time to think through how to approach this," he said. "Crail has judicial authority, and at least one corrupt relationship with the sheriff's office. Any legal strategy has to account for both." "I know," she said. "Take whatever time you need. But I want you to understand that the window is not indefinite. Crail is moving. He came out here to look at me. He is deciding something." Callum nodded and went back to the house. He sat at the kitchen table with the lamp turned low and thought about Harlan Crail, who had been a deputy territorial court clerk in 1870 when the guardianship was signed, and who had become a judge 2 years later, who had placed an 18-year-old girl under the control of his cousin, who had been riding out to look at her like a man confirming the condition of an investment. She had been living inside a plan to steal from her since she was 15 years old. He sat with that for a long time, and then he thought about Danny Reyes, and about the mother who had said her boy would not want him living as though Danny wasn't worth being remembered by someone still alive. And he thought about what it meant to be given a chance to do the thing correctly this time, with full information and clear sight, and no darkness obscuring what he was looking at. He went to bed. He did not sleep for a long time. In the tack room, Ruth rolled up the map carefully, tied it with a piece of twine, and stood it against the wall. She put the mesquite wood back in her boot. She turned off the lamp and walked back to her room in the dark. And for the first time in 3 years, she lay down without running calculations, because the calculation had reached the point where more thinking would not improve it. The next part required a different kind of work. The county fair happened the 3rd week of September every year, and Callum Wade had not attended in 4 years. This year he still did not attend, but the night before it he sat on the back porch of Broken Spur Ranch after midnight with the everyday knife in his hand and thought about a boy named Danny Reyes, who had been 14 years old and had liked to fish in the creek behind his house. Ruth found him there. She had learned to read the quality of his silences over 2 months of close proximity, the way a person learns to read the weather in a particular valley, not by applying a general rule, but by accumulating specific observations until the pattern becomes readable. This silence was different from his usual quiet. This one had weight to it, the particular weight of something that was carried regularly and did not get lighter with carrying. She sat down beside him, not too close, not pointedly far, just beside him, in the natural distance of two people who had been working together long enough to know each other's physical habit. She did not say anything. She had learned that he was a person who came to speech in his own time, and that pressure from outside his own timing was counterproductive. So she sat in the warm dark of the Arizona night and looked at the stars and waited. After 15 minutes, without looking at her, he said, "Tomorrow is the anniversary. Danny Reyes, 4 years." Ruth did not say she was sorry. She had observed over 2 months that apologies without capacity for remedy were something he found difficult to receive, perhaps because he had been making them himself for 4 years with no way to make them sufficient. She thought about what was actually useful and asked the question that was actually in her mind. "What did he like?" she said. Callum turned to look at her. The question came from a direction he had not expected and got through his defenses before they could come up to meet it. "Fishing," he said after a moment. His voice was different from his usual voice, quieter and somehow older. "His mother told me. He used to fish in the creek behind their house every morning before school. She said he would get up before anyone else and go out there in the dark and just sit with a line in the water. She said sometimes she would hear him come back in and go to sleep and then get up again for school, and he never told her what he caught or did not catch. He just went." "You met his mother?" "Once, a few months after it happened. I rode out to their place. I needed to say it to her directly." "What did she say?" Callum looked at the knife in his hand. The handle was smooth from years of daily use, the grain of the wood worn away to a polished surface except for the carved date, which stayed sharp because the cutting tool had gone deeper than the wear could reach. "She said her boy would not want me living as though he was not worth being remembered by someone still alive." He paused. She said it quietly, not as a rebuke, just as a fact she thought I should have. The night wind moved through the warm, dry Arizona dark, carrying the smell of creosote and cooling rock, and it extinguished the small oil lamp on the porch rail as it passed. The darkness was sudden, and the stars were immediately visible in a way they were not when the lamp competed with them. Thick and close enough to seem structural, to seem like the actual architecture of the sky rather than decorations hung against it. Ruth looked up at them by habit. She oriented herself the way her father had taught her, finding the North Star, and then working outward from there to name what she saw. "My father told me the light from stars takes so long to reach us that we are always actually seeing the past," she said. "He said some of those stars up there are not even there anymore. They burned out years or thousands of years ago, and we are only now seeing the light that left them before they went. He said it meant that what you were looking at was not really the present, but the past, arriving in the present." She paused and thought about how to say the second part accurately. "I used to think that was sad. Now I think it means he is still sending something forward. The light he made while he was here is still traveling. It just takes a while to arrive where it is going." Callum did not answer. He sat with that for a long time, long enough that she was not certain he was going to speak again. And then, when she stood to go inside, he said her name. She stopped. "Thank you," he said, "for not telling me it will all be all right." "I do not know if it will all be all right," she said honestly. "I genuinely do not know. But I know you are not a bad man. Bad men do not carve the names of people they have hurt into something they carry every day. They do not go to the mother and sit with her. They move on and make the next mistake and the one after that, and they never feel the weight of it." She looked at him. "Whatever you did 4 years ago, you are not the version of yourself who does that anymore. And I think Danny Reyes's mother knew that when she told you what she told you." She went inside. Callum sat on the porch in the dark and thought about what she had said, turning it over the way you turn over a piece of terrain you have been studying from the wrong angle, looking for the reading that makes the geography intelligible. He thought about it for a long time. He thought about the girl who had sat beside him for 15 minutes without saying anything because she understood that he needed to come to speech on his own. Who had asked not what happened or why or how he felt about it, but what the boy had liked. As though Danny Reyes was a complete person who deserved to be remembered in all his specific particularity, and not just as the weight Callum carried. He thought about 3 years of carrying a piece of mesquite wood in a boot sole and calling it evidence. He thought about patience, and about what it required of a person to be patient for that long without losing the thread of what they were patient toward. He went inside eventually and lay down on his bed and looked at the ceiling and thought, I was given a second chance here. I was given the chance to see clearly and act correctly and not make the same kind of mistake again. The mistake of moving before I understood what I was moving toward. Do not make the mistake again. In her room down the hall, Ruth lay on her back with the bolt thrown home and looked at the ceiling and thought about what she had said on the porch and whether she had said too much. She had not intended to say the part about bad men. It had come out because she believed it, and she recognized, becoming someone who said things she believed to this man in a way she did not say them to other people. That was information. She noted it carefully and set it aside. What she could not set aside was the sense growing stronger over 2 months of observation that the resource she had been waiting for was not just the legal standing she needed. It was something more specific than that, and she was not yet ready to name it. But it was there, growing in the space between the things they did not say, as patient and as stubborn as everything else in the Arizona desert that was waiting for enough water to grow. Callum rode to town on a Thursday to file the quarterly bank paperwork, which took the better part of the day, and he was gone by 6 in the morning, and Elias Horn arrived at Broken Spur Ranch at 8:15. He came with a county deputy named Morrison who had a legitimate badge and a document with Harlan Crail's signature at the bottom. The document was a court order citing violation of the labor secondment agreement terms. The violation listed was fabricated, a claim about unauthorized correspondence that would not have survived a legal challenge, but the paper was real, and the signature was real, and Morrison, who was following instructions from the sheriff's office, had no legal standing to refuse to enforce it. Ruth read the order twice. She looked at Morrison's face and determined that he was uncomfortable rather than complicit, which was a meaningful difference, and also an insufficient one. I need a few minutes to gather my things, she said. You do not have things, Elias said, with the pleasant accuracy of a man delivering information rather than a cruelty, because to him the distinction did not exist. He was right. She had the clothes on her back and the boot with the mesquite wood in it, and $15 sewn into the hem of her spare dress. She walked to her room and put on the spare dress over the one she was wearing, and walked back out. And that was all of it. She did not look at the room when she left it. She looked at the east window and noted the quality of the morning light and thought, this is not over. This has not ended. This is a change in conditions that requires a change in approach. Garrett was at the far fence when she passed through the yard. He started toward her and she gave him the smallest possible shake of her head. He stopped. He understood. Callum came back to an empty ranch at 4 in the afternoon and found Garrett waiting at the fence line. Garrett explained in 3 sentences. Callum unsaddled his horse and fed her and saddled a different one and rode to town. He went directly to the Golden Spur. Elias was behind the bar with the particular satisfaction of a man whose plan has executed on schedule. He produced the letter without being asked, as though he had been holding it ready, which he had. The letter was in Ruth's handwriting. Callum knew that handwriting from 3 months of ledger books and analyses and the ranch records she had reorganized in the first 2 weeks. Her notation was distinctive, precise, and economical. The handwriting of someone who had learned to write in the margins of pamphlets and on whatever paper was available. The letter said that Callum Wade was holding her at Broken Spur Ranch against her will in order to compel her signature on the Sycamore Valley deed. It asked Elias to come and bring her home. Callum read it once, read it again. The words did not change. He rode back to Broken Spur without speaking further to Elias. He went to Ruth's room. The door was open. The room was exactly as she had kept it, which was to say completely ordered, bed made with military precision, nothing out of place, nothing left on any surface. She had owned nothing to leave. On the small table by the east window, the stub of a charcoal pencil she had used to draw the map. Callum picked it up, set it down, went outside. He had believed his instincts again. He had trusted them enough to act on them, to let a person into the life he kept carefully empty, to talk on a dark porch about Danny Reyes, to look at a map spread on the tackroom floor and think, this one is different. And here was the result, in her own handwriting. He did not go to bed that night. He sat at the kitchen table in the dark and looked at the surface of it, and thought about all the things he had done correctly, and how they had not been sufficient, and about whether there was a version of himself that was capable of trusting the right thing, and whether he had ever had access to that version, or whether he had been wrong about himself as well as about everything else. Garrett came in at 8 in the evening. He sat across the table. He did not say anything for a while. "She chose to go back," Callum said. "Mr. Wade," Garrett said quietly, "I do not think she had a choice. She wrote the letter. I know what she wrote, and I know that girl. I watched her correct your figures without taking credit for it. I watched her come out in a hailstorm at 2 in the morning when nobody asked her to. I watched her work 2 months of drought conditions without complaining once and without asking for anything she had not been offered." He paused. "A person who does all of that is not a person who writes letters like that one, not willingly. Those two things do not add up to the same person." Callum said nothing. "There is more to this than what is in that letter," Garrett said. "I do not know what it is, but I know that." He got up and went to bed. Callum sat in the dark kitchen and thought about Garrett's words and about the piece of mesquite wood, and about a girl who had been carrying evidence in her boot for 3 years, and had not told him why until she was certain of him. Had said, "I needed to know whether you would help me because of me or because of what I have." He thought about that for a very long time. 3 nights later, at the Golden Spur, Ruth lay on the straw pallet in the storage room and took the piece of mesquite wood from her boot. She turned it in her fingers in the dark. It was smooth on the surfaces that had been against leather and skin, rough on the carved face, and she knew every irregularity of it, the way you know the shape of something you have held in the dark thousands of times. She had kept this through everything, every plan that failed, every person who could not or would not help. Every morning that required a fresh decision to continue, she had kept it because it was proof that something had once been hers and might be again. For the first time since leaving the ranch, she let herself cry, not from pain. From the specific grief of having trusted someone and feeling the absence of that trust as a physical thing, a missing structure, the way a pulled tooth leaves an absence that the tongue returns to constantly, unable to stop. She let herself cry for exactly as long as it took to get through it. Then she wiped her face on the hem of her dress and thought clearly about what she had to do next. She was not going to wait for Callum. She could not afford to wait for anyone. She had one chance at this, one window before Crail moved decisively, and she was going to take that window alone if she had to. She was going to use it better if she did not have to. In the morning, she told Elias she needed to go to the dry goods store for household supplies. He gave her 1 hour and sent a man named Burke to follow her at 10 feet. She led Burke to the dry goods store. She went to the back, through to the service door, down the alley to the left, around the block, and up the outside staircase of the assay office to the second-floor office of attorney Amos Whitfield, who worked alone and had no documented professional relationship with either Harlan Crail or Elias Horn. She had $15 sewn into the hem of the dress she was now wearing. Her entire savings from 3 months of ranch wages kept in the hem because she had never trusted Elias not to search her boot. She paid $10 to Whitfield to listen for 1 hour and $5 as a retainer. She laid out the case in the organized and specific manner of someone who had been building the argument in her head for 3 years. The guardianship order of 1870. Harlan Crail's position as Deputy Territorial Court Clerk at the time of signing, the relationship between Crail and Elias, the land certificate, the railroad routing, the deliberate undervaluation of the estate in the guardianship petition. She took the mesquite wood from her boot and put it on Whitfield's desk. She unfolded the map she had drawn on a piece of paper she had found in the storage room and brought with her. Whitfield listened without speaking. He was a thin man in his 50s with careful eyes that moved between her face and the materials she was presenting with the evaluating attention of someone who had learned to read both documents and the people presenting them. When she finished, he picked up the mesquite wood and turned it over. "You have grounds," he said, "but to get this in front of a judge who is not Crail or compromised by Crail, you need someone with standing to corroborate your account. The evidence alone will not be enough. A judge will want a credible witness, someone whose testimony cannot be dismissed as interested or unreliable." "I know," Ruth said. "Do you have anyone?" She thought about the man who had read her letter and gone cold, who had sat in a dark kitchen and thought whatever he had thought about her afterward, who had looked at her handwriting and believed what it appeared to say. "I am not certain," she said, "but I'm going to try." She went back to the Golden Spur with 3 minutes to spare before Elias expected her. Burke had not found her, which she had calculated. He was still standing outside the dry goods store. That evening she wrote a letter. It said, "I wrote that letter because Elias threatened to burn your barn with Garrett and the horses inside. I wrote what he told me to write. I understand if you do not believe me. I am not writing this to ask you to believe me. I am writing because I need a witness with standing, and you are the only person I know who qualifies. If you will not help, I understand. I will find another way." That was all of it. She read it once and folded it and gave it to a boy on the street the next morning with 2 pennies and the address of Broken Spur Ranch. Then she went back inside and did the work she was required to do and waited. At Broken Spur Ranch that afternoon, Callum read the letter at the kitchen table. He read it twice. He sat with it for a long time. Then he got up and went to the barn and saddled Ezra. Garrett was at the fence. "Going somewhere," Garrett said. "Tucson," Callum said. Garrett nodded once, the slow nod of a man who has been waiting for a thing and is satisfied to see it happen. "I will look after the herd," he said. Amos Whitfield's office in Tucson occupied 2 rooms on the 2nd floor of the assay building, and it smelled of pipe tobacco and the particular paper smell of documents that have been handled many times. Callum arrived on a Friday morning. Ruth was already there, sitting in the chair nearest the window with her back straight and her hands folded on the table with the stillness of a person keeping pain out of visible range. She looked at him when he came in. He looked at her. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "Thank you for coming," she said. "Yes," he said, which was not quite an answer to what she had said, but was an answer to something. Whitfield had been doing work in the 3 weeks since Ruth first came to his office, and what he had found was substantial. He laid it out methodically, in the way that good attorneys lay out a case, moving from established fact to inference to documented evidence in a sequence that built rather than jumped. He had found the fire investigator. Samuel Akers, retired, living in a small town in New Mexico Territory, had been the territorial fire investigator assigned to the Callaway House fire in 1870. Akers had filed a report at the time noting characteristics of the fire inconsistent with accidental origin. The fire had started in 2 separate locations simultaneously. This was not consistent with any common accidental ignition scenario. It was consistent with deliberate ignition at multiple points. The report had not been entered into the county record. Akers had been told by Harlan Crail, then Deputy Territorial Court Clerk, that the report would not be filed. Akers had been, in his own words in the written statement he had provided to Whitfield, given clearly to understand that his continued employment in the territory depended on his agreement with this decision. Thomas Callaway had refused to sell 340 acres in Sycamore Valley to a land development partnership in which Harlan Crail held a silent interest. He had refused 11 days before the fire. Whitfield laid all of this on the table between them. When he finished, the room was quiet. Ruth sat with it. Callum watched her take it in. She did not cry. She did not make any visible response for a long moment. Then she sat slightly straighter than she had been sitting, which was the only movement she made. "Your father did not just die," Whitfield said quietly. "He was killed because he refused to sell what was not his to sell." Ruth closed her eyes. Outside the window, the Tucson street noise continued, horses and voices and the ordinary traffic of a territorial city, indifferent to what was happening in a small upstairs office. When she opened her eyes, she looked at Callum. He met her gaze and held it without looking away. The rain started outside, the heavy monsoon rain that the desert produced when the heat had been building long enough. It came down straight and hard and dropped the temperature in the room by 10 degrees in minutes. And the smell of wet desert came through the window gap and filled the space. Ruth breathed it in. 5 days later, they were in the Pima County Courthouse. Before the proceedings began, Harlan Crail intercepted Callum in the hallway outside the courtroom. He was well-dressed and unhurried, the posture of a man who had spent decades being the most authoritative person in whatever room he entered. "You have a bank note due on Broken Spur in 60 days, Crail said. $2,400. I have looked into it." A pause. "Walk away from this courtroom today, and that note disappears. The girl has no real claim. It will be sorted in time. Your ranch is something you have built. It would be a shame to lose it." Callum looked at him for a long moment. "I will see you inside," he said. Whitfield presented the evidence in sequence. The land certificate registration with the number matching the carving on the mesquite wood. The railroad survey routing showing the line through the Sycamore Valley property. The financial records documenting Crail's interest in the development partnership that had approached Thomas Calloway. The procedural records showing the sequence of Crail's actions in the weeks following the fire. The guardianship petition filed within 11 days of the deaths. The estate valuation that listed 340 acres of potentially valuable land at $40. Samuel Akers's written deposition was read aloud by Whitfield in the measured tone of a man who wanted the words to land with their full weight. Ruth testified for 40 minutes. She spoke without notes and without performance, about 3 years at the Golden Spur, about her father and what he had taught her and what he had told her the night before the fire. She placed the piece of mesquite wood on the evidence table and explained what it was and how she had carried it. Callum testified about her character through specific and documented actions. The cattle analysis that had saved the ranch from a foreclosure timeline, the corrected financials, the surveying knowledge that only a trained engineer's daughter would possess. He stated clearly that the letter she had written under duress was inconsistent with every behavior he had observed over 3 months of close and daily work. He stated that he should have recognized this immediately, that he had not, that this was his error. He said those last 3 sentences publicly, on the record, in front of everyone in the room. Then he walked back to the plaintiff's side and sat down beside Ruth. The hearing proceeded well until, near its conclusion, Crail's attorney produced a second version of the Calloway land registration. The document was dated 3 months after Thomas Calloway's death and purported to transfer administrative authority over the property to the territorial court, superseding the original registration. The implication was that Ruth had no direct claim because the property had been taken into court administration before she could have reached legal majority. The room went quiet. Ruth looked at the document. Whitfield looked at it. Whitfield asked one question. "What notary seal appears on this document?" The seal belonged to a notary named George Wills. Wills had operated in Tucson from 1867. He had died of cholera in the summer of 1870. The document before the court was dated November of 1870. 6 weeks after George Wills was in the ground. The document was a forgery. It was Crail's forgery. Harlan Crail was remanded to the custody of the Pima County Sheriff before he reached the courtroom doors. He would be held at the Pima County Jail pending formal charges of judicial misconduct, deed fraud, and conspiracy relating to the suppression of the 1870 fire investigation report. Elias Horn left before the ruling was fully read. He did not run exactly. He simply moved toward the door with the steady pace of a man deciding not to be somewhere anymore. And by the time the room's attention returned to where he had been sitting, he was already in the street. After the proceedings, Ruth and Callum stood on the courthouse steps. The rain had stopped. The streets of Tucson smelled like wet adobe and clean desert air. The other people had dispersed. "I am sorry I believed the letter," Callum said. No qualification attached. "I understand why you did," Ruth said. "I wrote it. Not your words." "No. But I did not tell you about the land, about Crail, about what I was planning. I kept things from you that mattered because I was not certain of your motivations. That was not fair to you." They stood on the wet steps in the evening light. "We both kept things back," Callum said, "both afraid of the same thing." What thing? He thought about it. Trusting someone and being wrong about them. "Yes," Ruth said. Ruth. That. "So what do we do now?" he said. Ruth looked at the horizon. The desert after monsoon rain had that brief and improbable green to it, growth pushing up out of cracked ground as though it had been waiting for exactly this amount of water and no more. "We stopped keeping things back," she said. That afternoon they rode back to Broken Spur, and Callum walked her through the ranch in the long evening light, not as an employer showing a new employee around, but as a man showing someone what he valued. Every fence line and water trough, every animal by name and habit and individual history. He talked more than his usual, because something had been freed up in the doing of what he had done in that courtroom, some closure on a long-held tightness. Ruth walked beside him and did not calculate exits. Under the cottonwood tree beside the creek, which was running now for the first time since she had arrived, fed by 3 days of monsoon rain, Callum took the knife from his belt. The everyday knife with the carved date on the handle. September 14th, 1869. He held it out to her. "I want you to have this," he said. "Why?" "Because you helped me think about Danny Reyes as a person instead of a weight I carry. I would like to carry something lighter." Ruth took the knife and looked at the date. She looked at it for a long time. "I will keep it carefully," she said. "I know you will." They sat by the running creek in the last of the evening light, listening to the water that had been absent for months and was present now. And Callum said her name and asked if she wanted to stay. "Not as an arrangement," he said. "Just stay." Ruth looked at the water. "You need to understand, I will not always agree with you," she said. "I would be concerned if you did. And the sycamore land is mine, fully mine. Whatever I decide to do with it, completely yours. And you are going to be wrong, fairly regularly." "More than fairly regularly," Callum said. And something in the way he said it, a self-awareness, a dryness that was the first real humor she had heard from him in 3 months, made her look at him and see clearly, perhaps for the first time, not a damaged man managing a long guilt, not a former marshal with useful standing, not an employer or a guardian or a resource, but a person. A specific, flawed, honest person who had sat down in a dark alley because he heard a sound and could not keep walking. "All right," she said. "I will stay." At the far end of the yard, Garrett climbed down from the fence rail where he had been sitting and walked to the barn. The sound of a one-sided conversation with a horse drifted back across the yard. The specific words were not audible. The tone was thoroughly satisfied. 3 years later, Ruth Calloway signed a 20-year lease agreement with the Arizona and Pacific Railroad in Amos Whitfield's Tucson office, and every term in that agreement was hers. She had negotiated them herself over 4 months of correspondence, working from the ranch in the early mornings before the day's other business began, using the topographical knowledge and the railroad survey routing she had memorized years ago in a saloon storage room. The lease rate reflected the actual value of the right-of-way access, not the value that the railroad's initial offer had proposed, which had been considerably lower. She had known it was lower because she had done the same arithmetic the railroad's landmen had done and arrived at a different conclusion about what fair market value meant when you were the one with the land rather than the one who needed it. The lease income designation was written into the agreement in the language Whitfield had helped her draft. A permanent allocation to fund construction and operation of a school in Dusty Creek, Arizona Territory, for children without families or with insufficient family resources to support education. The railroad's regional director had signed it without objection, possibly because the amount involved was small relative to the lease value, and possibly because he could see it coming either way. Ruth was setting the signed copy in her folder when the office door opened and Callum came in with 2 cups of coffee and a document she did not immediately recognize. He set the coffee down. He placed the document in front of her. It was a deed transfer for 50 acres of Broken Spur Ranch, filed with the Pima County Recorder 6 weeks ago, naming Ruth Calloway as co-owner of record. She looked at it for a moment. "This is your portion of the ranch," Callum said. "I filed it before I knew I was going to be here today. Not to persuade you of anything. It was simply the right thing to do, and I should have done it earlier." Ruth looked at the deed, looked up at him. "Are you proposing to me with property?" she said. "I am telling you that whether you say yes or no today, you have a place in my life. But I would like to ask if you want to make it official." "You are not asking me if I love you." "I know you do," he said. Not with arrogance. With the quiet certainty of a man who had learned, at considerable personal cost, to read people accurately and trust what he read. "What I am asking is whether you want this life. The cold winters, the cattle work, the fact that I am genuinely difficult before 8 in the morning." "You are considerably worse than difficult," Ruth said. "I know that." She looked at him for a moment. 3 years of building something from the ground up together. The ranch recovering from the drought, the school in Dusty Creek that had its first 12 students the previous fall, the long evenings on the porch where they talked or did not talk with equal ease. 3 years of learning what it meant to make a decision about a life because you wanted to, rather than because you were required to. "All right," she said, "because at least you are honest about it." The wedding was at Broken Spur, under the cottonwood tree beside the creek. It was a spring morning with light wind and no rain, and a sky the deep, clear blue that Arizona produces in the mild season before the summer heat arrives. Not a dramatic sky, not a sky asking to be remarked upon. Just a good morning, the ordinary kind, which Ruth had come to understand was rarer and more valuable than the spectacular kind because it was sustainable. Garrett stood as witness in a clean shirt that was slightly too short in the sleeves, a fact he appeared entirely unconcerned about. Martha Whitfield, who had become Ruth's first real friend over 3 years of working alongside the law practice, stood beside her. The new territorial court judge from Tucson, appointed after the full audit of Harlan Crayle's 18 years on the bench, read the ceremony in a clear voice that carried well in the open air. The creek ran beside them throughout. It had been running reliably since the drought broke 2 winters prior, and Ruth had come to think of the sound of it as the sound of Broken Spur at its best, fully resourced, working as it was meant to work. When the ceremony ended, Garrett shook Callum's hand with the gravity of a man completing a transaction that has been a long time pending. He nodded at Ruth. She nodded back. It was the complete exchange, containing everything it needed to contain. 6 years after the wedding, on a morning in June when the light came in at the low angle that preceded the full heat of the day, Ruth stood at the door of the house in Sycamore Valley with a coffee cup in one hand and a piece of mesquite wood in the other, and watched her husband and her son on the eastern ridge. The house had been built on the exact footprint of the house that had burned in 1870. She had made this decision deliberately, after careful thought, because she had concluded that the ground itself had not done anything wrong. The ground was her father's ground and her ground, and now her son's ground, and it deserved to be stood on rather than avoided. Different walls, different roof, different people living different lives inside it, but the same view from the kitchen window, the same orientation toward the mountains. The same land under it, holding its value quietly the way land does, indifferent to what human beings decide to do with it and what they decide it means. The mesquite wood was warm in her palm. 340 SYC 1870 TC. She did not need it anymore. She kept it because some things deserved to be remembered in a form you could hold, and because on the days when she forgot what the past had been, it reminded her, and on the days when she could not stop thinking about what the past had been, it reminded her of that too, and both kinds of remembering were necessary. On the eastern ridge, Thomas, who was 4 years old and took after his grandfather in his interest in terrain, was sitting on Callum's shoulders and pointing at the horizon, with the authoritative gesture of a child who has recently discovered that pointing at things and asking about them is a reliable method for obtaining information. Callum was answering. Thomas was nodding with the satisfaction of someone receiving information he could not yet fully process, but trusted was accurate. This was a quality of Thomas's relationship with his father that Ruth found she did not worry about. Callum Wade was not a man who gave comfortable answers. He gave honest ones. The boy would be well served by that over time. The Dusty Creek School had 37 students enrolled for the coming year. 4 of them were children with no family, enrolled under the standing fund Ruth had established from the railroad lease income in the first year of the agreement. The school had been operating for 4 years and had already produced outcomes she had not planned for. 2 girls from ranching families who intended to study law in Tucson. A boy from a mining family who had taught himself survey work using the manual she had donated to the school library, and a general condition in the town in which children who arrived with nothing did not leave with nothing. She did not explain her reasons for the fund to people who asked. The people who understood did not need the explanation. Harlan Crail had been tried at the Pima County Courthouse in the fall of 1874. The territorial prosecutor had worked the case for 18 months, and the record that resulted was thorough and complete. Crail was convicted on charges of deed fraud and conspiracy in the suppression of an official investigation record. He was sentenced to 7 years at the territorial prison at Yuma. Ruth had learned the verdict from Whitfield's letter, read it twice, set it on the kitchen table, and gone back outside to the work she had been doing before the letter arrived. There was no celebration. There was only the quiet, specific feeling of a door closing on something that had been left open too long. Not triumph, not even full satisfaction. Just the solid, ordinary feeling of a thing being finished. Elias Horn had lost the Golden Spur in the civil proceedings that followed Crail's criminal case. The saloon's finances had not survived examination. He had sold what remained and left Dusty Creek, and no one had tracked where he went. And he had become, in the economy of Ruth's daily thinking, a man no longer worth the effort of maintaining any feeling about. That, she had come to understand, was its own kind of resolution. Not forgiveness exactly, but the dissolution of the hold a person has on your attention when they no longer have any hold on your life. Callum visited Maria Reyes once each year. Danny Reyes' mother still lived outside Tucson, and she had come to expect the annual visit in the way you come to expect things that have become part of the natural order of your year. She and Callum spoke about many things now, not only about Danny. They spoke about Thomas, whom she had met the previous year and declared to have his grandfather's hands. They spoke about the ranch and the school. They spoke about the small details of ordinary life that accumulate into a life over time. On the last visit, she had told Callum that her boy used to talk about wanting to fish every body of water in Arizona before he was grown. She told him this as a matter of completeness, adding a piece to the picture of who her son had been, not as a grief, but as an addition to the record of a specific person who had existed and deserved to be remembered specifically. Callum had come home from that visit and told Ruth about it at dinner. She had listened to all of it without interrupting. Garrett had not left Broken Spur. He was too old for the heaviest work now and did it anyway. And he had taken up the project of teaching Thomas to ride with the gravity of a man who considered horsemanship a form of moral instruction. When Ruth had asked once whether he had thought about moving on, he had said, "And go where? This is the most interesting place I've ever worked." Ruth had not argued with this because it was almost certainly true. On the ridge, Thomas had identified something new on the horizon and was reorganizing his pointing accordingly. Callum turned with him, patient with the redirection, because patience with what was in front of him was something he had been practicing for a long time now and had gotten reasonably good at. Ruth set down the coffee cup and stepped off the porch. Thomas saw her and came down the slope at the run, the full-speed downhill run of a small child who has not yet learned to moderate confidence with caution, covering the distance with complete commitment. Arriving at her side slightly out of breath and with a blue jay feather in his hand, its color an improbable bright blue against the dry landscape. The kind of color that seems like an error in the desert but is not an error, is simply the ordinary miracle of a bird deciding to exist in a place that seems unlikely. "Mama," he said, inserting himself against her side in the manner of a child who has not yet questioned whether this is welcome. "I found it. It was just there on the ground." Ruth put her hand on his head. The feather was the blue of a specific kind of sky, the kind without weather in it, clear and uncomplicated and entirely itself. "Keep it safe," she said. "Beautiful things deserve to be kept." Thomas examined the feather with renewed seriousness, weighing the instruction. Then he extended it toward her so she could look at it properly, because he had not yet learned to keep beautiful things only for himself, and she hoped he would be slow to learn that particular lesson. Callum came down the slope at a walking pace and stopped in the yard. He stood watching the two of them in the June morning light, and he had the look of a man who understood, with full and specific knowledge, the distance between where he had been and where he was, and who did not find it necessary to look away from either end of that distance. Ruth met his eyes across the yard. He nodded once, the complete nod, the one that contained everything a longer speech might hold, the nod of a man who had learned that the truest things did not require ornament. She nodded back. Thomas had moved on to the question of whether the horses had seen anything as interesting as his feather this morning, and he was pulling her hand toward the barn to investigate, because at 4 years old the distance between a new question and the need to answer it was approximately 3 seconds. Ruth let herself be pulled forward into the ordinary morning of her life, which was full and real and entirely hers. The mesquite wood was in her pocket. 340 SYC 1870 TC. Her father's land. Her land. The number her father had pressed into her memory on the last night of the world that had been, saying whatever happens, as though he had known something was coming, as though the love he had for her was far-sighted enough to reach past what he could not survive and find her on the other side of it. The light he had sent forward had arrived. It had taken years, and it had traveled through darkness, and it had arrived, the way her father had taught her that starlight arrives, completing its journey without regard for how long the journey took. She walked toward the barn with her son's hand in hers, and the morning around her and the land under her feet, and she thought, this is what he meant. This is the whatever happens. This is what was waiting on the other side of all of it. This is enough. This is, in every way that the word can hold, more than enough. And the door to what had been closed quietly, and the door to what was remained open, and the blue jay feather caught the June light as Thomas held it up, bright as any star, traveling forward, arriving. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.